We are nearing the end of this year, and looking back on it, 2024 was a historically significant year for video games, but not necessarily a hopeful one. There were some unbelievably great games that changed my view of the industry and what games can do, but also some of the worst failures the industry has ever seen. Let's just say that there's not much concord between fans and game studio executives this year. I think when it comes to video games, a big change is coming soon. In a similar video last year, I also said 2023's video games were historical, and if you've seen it already, you're probably thinking I'm gonna just repeat those talking points with slightly better audio quality about a different year, but I can assure you there's something different here. There is a dissonance in this industry between the direction big game studios are going and the way indie games are going, and the only way I can describe it is liminal. The games industry feels like it's at a crossroads, a transitory period between the era it's at now and something different. I don't know what the games industry will look like in a few years, but I think there will be lots of changes. So in this video, I'll go over all the games I played this year, all the big events that happened, and what I think is so weird about the industry right now. Do note these are all my opinions, and I haven't played every game this year. I normally don't play most games as they come out, so apologies to any, Metaphor Refantasio fan or something who might be upset I didn't talk about your game. I actually do talk about that one, but whatever. I'll also be discussing my game of the year at the end, so look out for that too. Before I get started, I have a Patreon now. There's some exclusive stuff on there, so check it out if you're interested in supporting me a little bit more. It's a pay what you want system with a $1 minimum. I'd also appreciate it if you could subscribe, as I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of 2025. Thank you. In February this year, a heavy dose of nostalgia for a game that's almost 30 years old was injected directly into my veins. What game, you might ask? The CDI Zelda series. It's RZ, the Jewel of Fairmore. Where do I even begin with this? In recent times, we've seen lots of indie games that are essentially reboots of games they take inspiration from. Pizza Tower with Wario Land, Bomb Rush Cyberpunk with Jet Set Radio, Disc Creatures with Pokemon. These games are normally made with reverence for the source material while building on their ideas and gameplay. It's no surprise someone would want to, because they're awesome games. With RZ, the game it's building on isn't exactly good. Zelda the Wand of Gamelon. It's infamously one of the worst games ever made, and were huge memes back in the day. But I think there's a reason they became so meme-worthy that goes beyond just they're bad. Thousands of denizens of the young internet can endlessly quote them. Squadla, we're off! I'm so hungry I could eat an Octorok. Come back when you're a bit, richer. And many hours are spent making and watching YouTube poops or just memes about them. These games are a legitimate part of internet history, and when I was a kid I laughed at them so hard I didn't even realize I was making memories with them. I have a sticker of King Harkinian on my laptop, the very one I am using to write this. To understand that the history of these games are more nuanced than just bad Zelda game bad requires a lot of understanding. RZ's existence is incredible. The CDI Zelda games have such a weird vibe, and it's so odd that they're genuine Nintendo products, from their low-budget acting and animation to the bizarre logic behind everything. And RZ captures the feeling of them so wonderfully. Everything about the Zelda CDI games could have only happened in the 90s, and capturing their animation and style so faithfully would have been a shit ton of work. But RZ's goal isn't just capturing these games, because it's very funny on purpose sometimes, and has some very likable characters that make it a treat to go through. Every NPC dialogue is like a reward for your progress. Just finding out what wacky mannerisms or stupid dialogue they have is a very effective motivator for playing. The protagonist herself, RZ, actually kicks ass and is a super likable character. As cliche as it might sound, you laugh with the characters, not at them. I love that early internet culture is being kept alive. There's even some dramatic scenes intended to be sad, which are silly of course, but still manage to make me feel something. My only real criticism for the cutscenes is that sometimes the rotoscoping can be uncanny, and I don't really think it was intended. It doesn't really look like anything from the Wand of Gamelon at all. I get that animation is hard, so it's not the biggest issue, it just comes up in a few cutscenes too. Gameplay-wise, it's for the most part fine. RZ has a simple style, but there's some fun to be had going through the levels, exploring them for secrets or NPCs. Some of the later levels, however, dip in quality, and the ending feels anticlimactic. There's backtracking which can get annoying at times, and overall the level structure could have been a little bit more polished. Yes, obviously it's inspired by a game that isn't polished, but none of these flaws feel like an intended part of the game, If they are, they still pull away from my enjoyment and are worth criticizing. Still though, this game's got a ton of joy to bring with nearly every aspect, and I will always be grateful it exists. I hope for good things in CDI's future. You know what? I'm really embarrassed. I just got the joke with the name CDI by saying it aloud. The great indie games will keep on coming, believe me. This next one is honestly probably my second favorite game of the year, Another Crab's Treasure. I was immediately intrigued by the concept of a Souls-like with a more cartoony, kid-friendly approach. I was wrong about the kid-friendly part, but it is more cartoony. The game starts in a jovial way and gets you hooked with under-the-scene charm mixed with dark humor. Microplastics are your currency. We are fucked as a species. It's not just trying to be a Souls-like, though. Another Crab's Treasure is trying to be the every Souls-like. There's a parry system like Sekiro, a system like Bloodborne where you essentially recover HP if you attack fast, and a shell system not too unlike humanity from Dark Souls. There are new stuff introduced to the formula too. The ambition with this indie game is staggering, and the game manages to pull all of those good elements even if it lacks the more focused direction and level design of traditional FromSoft. There's also some mechanical bloat, I feel. It's a big ask for the player to commit so much stuff to muscle memory for every boss fight. And it might sound a bit harsh, but trust me, having all the great stuff of the Souls-like genre in one game is not to be taken lightly. It does make for a unique game. I am glad the risk was taken. Of course, there's great boss design too, and some of them, like Haikea the Intimidation Crab, are among the best of the genre. They're pretty consistent bosses too, for better or for worse. A lot of them feel similar to fight against, and I wish there were some more undersea creatures that can make for bosses, like actual fish. I understand why it couldn't happen. I'm just saying, when I picture an under-the-sea Souls-like, I imagine cool fights against sharks and giant squids, maybe even paying tribute to Demon Souls with a manta ray. Most of the bosses in Another Crab's Treasure are just crabs or lobsters, and some felt like they lacked scale, even if they were well designed. Some weren't well designed, but we can ignore those. Meanwhile, holy shit, the story. As you progress, the nature of this happy-go-lucky world gets stripped away more and more, and the protagonist, Krill, has thoroughly lost his innocence. I don't really want to get into all the details since this video is long enough already, but I actually cried at the end of the stupid crab game. The game has a lot to say, and even if it can get heavy-handed or the gameplay can become bloated, it's a powerful experience. This funny crab game is seriously an examination of the harmful effects of crabitalism. If you like any Souls game, you really owe it to you to check this one out. I actually got it on my birthday where I was away from home, and I played it all summer pretty much. I also got another indie game alongside it, Animal Well. If Animal Well had released 5, maybe 10 years earlier, I think the critical reception would have been quite poor, and I mean that in the best way possible. This game brings to mind the stripped-down philosophies of games like Eco and Shadow of the Colossus, so the puzzles and their designs are in full focus, but it also makes it quite the slow burn experience. It takes hours into the slow game experience for it to really click with me, because it was so esoteric. Barely anything is explained, and there's no story context whatsoever. But guess what? Turns out this game clicked with a lot of people, and there was a ton of praise for Animal Well when it came out. I think the reason is because the puzzles kind of speak for themselves. The game entrusts the player to figure out everything in both the gameplay and everything else. Is it done perfectly? Not really. There are some puzzles I felt weren't done the greatest, but you can feel the respect for the player in the game, and I'm glad that it actually got praise and not just, "Ugh, nothing was explained to me. I'm a baby, also I work for IGN." I'm glad it was a success, is my point. Actually, the comparisons to Eco and Shadow of the Colossus aren't really the most accurate. Unlike those games, there's a ton to find if you explore, and lots of secrets. I guess it is kind of like Shadow of the Colossus remake, though. And while I didn't like it as much as Another Crab's Treasure, I only played it once. I can tell there's a lot more to play than just the single-digit amount of hours I spent on my playthrough. And I would love to fall in love with it if I ever replay it. I did promise I would talk about every game I played that came out in 2024, and you know what technically came out in 2024 that I played? MultiVersus. Not every game I'm talking about here is a great indie game. I will say this, MultiVersus was actually a lot of dumb fun for me. I enjoyed the few online matches I got up to, and the actual gameplay was enjoyable. I like that the game almost takes a more high-flying approach to platform fighters. Jason? Great addition. I've actually become pretty excited about speculating on the game's roster. I even made a video about it once. Jason's probably the character I use the most with Superman as a secondary. The real problem here, though, is the monetization. So many battle passes and different currencies just make this game so depressing to look at. It's a headache to figure out how to unlock characters or do anything. There's a campaign mode which is pretty much devoid of any redeeming qualities at all too. Amazing. Look, maybe there was once a time where I could stomach this game, but now, I don't want to play a game that hates me. Finally, let's talk about the last game I played this year. Nightmare Kart. This famously started as a Bloodborne fan game, but had to be retooled into its own thing. Even still, it feels genuinely surprising that this game is offered for free. With an entire campaign mode, it offers a lot more than other kart races out there. And even without the Bloodborne coat of paint, it's really cool to have a gothic Victorian themed kart racer. I mean, it's obviously still Bloodborne though. There's surprisingly lots of movement options for your racing in your kart, and the racing is very fleshed out. For one, I like how there are enemies placed on the track, which makes it so that even if you're in first place, you have them to fight against, so you have a use for your items. There are some spots where the game doesn't really work though. The Forbidden Forest track kinda sucks. They tried to make the layout complex, but it didn't end up working, and so it's very easy to get stuck a lot. But then again, boo-hoo, this free indie game had some jank in it, big deal. What I really like about the campaign is that there are lots of battle modes and unique bosses, and they just keep on coming throughout the whole game. Nightmare Kart will always remain fresh in its campaign. Of course, this isn't even to mention how charming it is to see Bloodborne essentially adapted in this way. There's so many interesting decisions and hilarious moments that make it an essential play for any Bloodborne fan. It's a shame this game isn't talked about much besides the novelty of Bloodborne racing. Those were all the new games I played this year, besides my Game of the Year. And look, normally I don't play that many indie games. The absolute quality of indies this year was pretty staggering, and a lot of them are very notable releases. But obviously what I played was not the entirety of the industry, so let's take a look at every other release I was too busy / broke to play. The most notable video game release of this year was probably Elden Ring: Shadow of the Erdtree. I have played about 60 hours of Elden Ring, and there's still so much I haven't discovered that buying more of it feels ridiculous to me. But hey, if you're one of those freaks with hundreds and hundreds of hours in the game, I can understand wanting it. I just think it's pretty damn notable that this is arguably the game released this year that's made the biggest splash culturally, even compared to all the big AAA releases. The very fact that it's a DLC basically automatically means a subset of players won't be interested in it. It just shows how big Elden Ring was as a release. Take the three biggest RPG releases that aren't DLC were Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Metaphor ReFantazio, and a secret third one that's totally not my Game of the Year. Maybe Persona 3 Reload too. From everything I've seen about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, it seems fine. I've heard some conflicting accounts. I felt like Final Fantasy VII Remake was fine too. The characters of Final Fantasy VII are at least great, and from what I've seen, the game does them justice. Rebirth really reignited a lot of the discourse of people that hate Final Fantasy VII Remake, specifically not liking that it does its own thing when it's called a remake. As it turns out, 4 years later, they haven't gotten past it. I think that's a silly way to look at it. The word remake is arbitrary and completely defined by fans. It's not completely inconceivable that what they're doing counts as a remake and not a reimagining or whatever term you just made up. Look, Square Enix is remaking all of Final Fantasy VII. Square Enix is remaking all of Final Fantasy VII. I just feel like you don't like the changes they made, so you say it's not a remake. Actually, now that I think about it, from what I've seen of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, I don't really like the changes either. I'm fine with building on the ideas of the original work and taking creative liberties, but with the Final Fantasy VII Remake series, it's just the exact same compilation of Final Fantasy VII BS that's been disappointing fans for years now. Oh no, Sephiroth's back! I'd love to be proven wrong, but I just don't like their additions all that much. Meanwhile, Metaphor ReFantazio seems cool. I really like some of the designs of this game, and it's great it was a success. Atlas is a company heavily associated with exactly one franchise, so it's just good to see them working out of their comfort zone a little. Oh yeah, Persona 3 Remake came out. I'm not that familiar with Persona 3, so I couldn't really say much about it, but it was a good idea for sure. That's pretty high praise from me. Usually I'm pretty cynical when it comes to the idea of a video game remake. Persona 3 lacks a lot of the quality of life changes of other Persona games, and just listening to some of the stuff in it sounds painful. Like, social links can rank down? Seriously? There's a lot of debate on which version of Persona 3 is the best, since FES and Persona 3 Portable both have lots of different content from each other. If only all that content were available in this remake. Oh well, at least Persona 3 Portable is on modern hardware now. I'm still keeping my Game of the Year a mystery for now, but on an unrelated note, have you guys seen the Yakuza TV show? That certainly was released. Look, I was actually excited for this show because Yakuza feels like a good game to adapt. Lots of iconic moments with room for creative liberties. I looked at some of the story summaries of each of the episodes, and I felt like they had some good ideas. Like having half the game set in 1995 and the other half in 2005. Yeah, the show wasn't great. All the discourse on the show centers around the amount of differences it had from the games. That's not unfair to the show because most of these differences really didn't have a reason to exist. But the more pressing matter is just that the show isn't very good. The narrative is confused, and for being a Yakuza adaptation, there's some of the least impactful action sequences I've ever seen. The only part of the show I liked was Yumi's character. She was fun to watch at least. She wasn't exactly the most impactful part of the original Yakuza. I haven't seen any other video game adaptations this year, so thank God you don't have to hear me talk about the Borderlands movie. Oh my god, do I really have to bitch about Tekken again? Whatever. Tekken 8 came out, and look, I'm a very casual fighting game fan, alright? And as a very casual fighting game fan, the story and roster of a game matter to me. When Tekken 8 kinda looks like Tekken 7, just with a higher fidelity, I'm gonna end up looking at the roster and wondering, okay, what's the point of buying this if I already have Tekken 7? And casual fans like me are most of who buy fighting games. The fact that they keep on adding more and more Tekken 7 characters, and the fact they couldn't even give Heihachi a break for one game, makes this even more frustrating. I've already made this exact complaint in like 2 other videos, so I will shut up now. I played lots of indie games this year, but the biggest one I haven't touched at all has probably got to be Baltaro. I don't think there's too much to say on it. Roguelikes are pretty much the #1 meh, not for me game, and I don't exactly think poker games appeal to me the most. But it is another example of just how big indie games managed to be this year. Pretty impressive for a roguelike poker game. The great streak of indie games is especially notable given the stuff the big console manufacturers were up to. I was interested in video games and watched YouTube videos about them from a very young age. So I have essentially spent my whole life learning fun facts about how big a failure E.T. for Atari 2600 was. But as it turns out, that game sold 1.5 million copies. The 1983 video game crash is nothing compared to the failures of today. Like Concord. Do I even need to explain what happened with this game, or just how drastically it flopped? There's no debate whatsoever, this is the biggest video game failure in history. And if some estimates are to be believed, in terms of how much it cost, it might just be bigger than any movie flop ever. Concord itself isn't even really the issue here, because I don't think it's likely to be much of an outlier for long. Video game budgets are getting bigger and bigger, ballooning well into the $200 to $300 million range, especially for Sony, but it applies to a lot of other companies too. It's just not feasible to have literally every game be so expensive. Even when $200 million games succeed, they're not that profitable. Look at Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. It sold 4 million copies and grossed $73 million. That should be great for a family game. When it cost $81 million to make, it's not enough to sustain a Concord machine. As of now, these failures only seem to affect the developers making these games as if this was their fault. Who can say if that will last forever? When an industry isn't sustainable, it means something has to change. Oh, but they made Astrobot this year, right? That game basically set the internet on fire, and yes, it was a success, but from what we've seen, it didn't do as well as Sony expected in certain markets. I would love if it ends up shifting Sony's priorities to more quality experiences, sure, but I didn't really see it as the most likely. I guess they had Helldivers 2 and Stellar Blade as well, so they did have some successes. Although, can I just say, it's so weird how in this current generation of hardware, the PS5 is essentially a non-entity. The PS5 has no games meme isn't just a meme. It's seriously true that the console is starved of exclusives in a way that's never really been true historically. Go to the Wikipedia page of PS5 exclusive right now, I dare you. 4 years since this thing launched, in the year of our Lord 2024, a game releasing on just current hardware is an outlier. It's gone to the point that some new games are releasing just for PS4. Is the cycle of new hardware generations that's been going on since the 80s gonna be around forever? Man, Sony's probably already thinking about the PS6. Also, the PS5 Pro? Once again, do I need to say anything? Sony just loves fletching away goodwill they get from Astrobot. And if the PS5 is a non-entity, you better believe the same applies to the current Xbox. It's practically a ghost of a console, and with Xbox putting over so many of their games to other systems, there's a legitimate conversation that they might not be a hardware manufacturer for that long. I think the Xbox will continue as a console, but stripped down in the future, and overall quite different from what the Xbox was originally envisioned as. Xbox as a brand has lost a lot of goodwill too due to their actions shutting down studios this year. The future of Sony is looking grim, the future of Xbox even grimmer. Oh well, at least they still have COD. Yeah, Call of Duty Black Ops 6 released, it was a big success. I'll be honest, the only reason I knew that game launched was because Dunky made a video on it. I remember my friend saying, hey, did you know they're making Black Ops 6 like 6 months ago? It just kinda came out then. He also said he thought the game was gonna quote unquote do Bush did 9/11, which I feel like his conception of what Call of Duty is willing to do is not exactly aligned with what this series actually is. Anyways, even though I haven't seen much buzz on it, I might just be able to chalk that up to me not knowing much. The numbers seem to say this game was a big deal. But here's the thing, this game was in development for 4 years, the most of any Call of Duty game yet. Last year's COD, Modern Warfare 3, which was rushed and wasn't even meant to be a game at first, underperformed. As this series moves on and Activision can't release games they've been cooking for so long, will this series have the success of Modern Warfare 3 or Black Ops 6? That's the thing I'm really curious to see. Call of Duty, with over 500 million copies sold, is essentially Microsoft's crutch. I wonder if it will hold for long. Also, Dragon Age was a surprise success. It outsold COD now, so people are gonna say that means Call of Duty failed, because if one game sells well, another can't. Let's talk about a cute indie game again. Video game alternate history has always been an interesting subject. I like the idea of world building a whole collection of video games and telling a story of a fictional developer that way. Along comes UFO 50, which accomplishes this crazy idea of mine, and you can actually play them. Man, this looks incredibly cool, and yet again, it's an indie game that's become one of the most notable releases this year. This game doesn't just have short little single-screen arcade games too, because it's basically 50 fully fledged arcade games in a package. This is a game I'm promising myself I will dive into soon. To be honest, the only reason I haven't played it yet is because I want to set lots of free time so I can fully go through everything and discover this universe of games. And money. Being broke is part of this too. I will give this dream game of mine its due time, don't worry. Capcom actually had a pretty impressive showing this year. They were continually updating Street Fighter 6, and they have a new Monster Hunter on the way, but the real standout is the collections they've been doing. It was such a bizarre feeling to wake up early for a Nintendo Direct and get both Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and Miles Edgeworth Investigations 2 finally re-released. The fact Marvel vs. Capcom was previously unavailable on modern hardware was a goddamn travesty, and Miles Edgeworth Investigations 2 was probably the single game with the most requests for an official English localization of, besides Mother 3. And then after Marvel vs. Capcom, my next natural question was, okay, when's Capcom vs. SNK though? And lo and behold, right after it is Capcom vs. SNK now. I would have preferred if the original Rival Schools and Star Gladiator were also available in the Capcom Fighting Collection too, but I understand that might be hard to emulate. You could probably make the case these are just re-releases and not worth getting that excited about. That's a fair argument, I guess, but I can't help my monkey brain from seeing Ryu and Cyclops in a box and going feral. There were also re-releases of some of the classic PlayStation Resident Evil games too. I'll be honest, I thought those were on PS4 already, but I'll take what I can get. If we look over at the Nintendo front of this console generation, things were weird. Their releases were mostly unexpected, like the Mario vs. Donkey Kong remake, Endless Ocean Luminous, Luigi's Mansion 2 HD, Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, Emio the Smiling Man, Super Mario Party Jamboree. I would not have expected this to be the year we get a Peach game, a Zelda game, the first M-rated game that was actually developed by a core Nintendo studio. The Paper Mario remake was probably the standout. It was nice to see the Thousand Year Door in the public conscious again, in such a big way. It was especially funny seeing people get mad at Vivian's mere existence. People have often said the Thousand Year Door could not have been made today with Nintendo's more brand-safe image. Seeing it made today, unexpected. A new Mario & Luigi game came out too, well, not actually. At the time of recording, it hasn't been released. Mario and Luigi being back is fantastic, and I hope this game can stand as a crown jewel of the Switch's twilight years. The art style is super fulfilling to me, and it's got a great evolution on the previous Alpha Dream games. Let's hope that the IGN review isn't accurate to Mario and Luigi fans' tastes, cause oof, that does not make it look good. I do not want the first non-Alpha Dream Mario and Luigi game to be the last. Wait, what company is even developing this game? Acquire. Okay, you know what? This reminds me of another thing. Nintendo has shown a bad habit this year of outright refusing to share names of development studios working on their games, leaving fans to have to see the credits to find out who made them. That's really weird. That lack of communication feels like an out-of-touch move that would have died in the 90s. We live in an age where people will stay up early to watch commercials unveiling Nintendo games. So for Nintendo to go out of their way to not credit developers until launch, feels like they're trying to downplay a development studio as an important part of the game. They're the ones who made the game. At the very least, it's just a dick move. Imagine if a big studio made a movie and just never released the names of the actors involved until the credits, and didn't allow them to say they were in the movie until it was released. Is this something that's outright harmful? Maybe not, but can you see how it might be shitty for the developers of a game? And honestly, that's not even Nintendo's most egregious crediting related sin this year. This requires a little setup. Remember when the DK rap from Donkey Kong 64 was in the Mario movie? There was a funny little Easter egg, but in the credits they didn't credit Grant Kirkhope, who actually composed the song. Instead, they graciously credited the Donkey Kong 64 cartridge for producing these notes completely of its own volition with no human hands at all. That was pretty scummy, and we all collectively recognized their mistake. Well, this year rolled in, and Nintendo had a surprise announcement for a music app where you can stream Nintendo music. No composer credits. Look, a slip up in a movie credits is one thing, but having an entire music service with no composer credits? That's awful. Nintendo Music was so unexpected when it came out, and yet the implementation is totally Nintendo. For years, people have been asking Nintendo to stop copyright claiming YouTube videos of their music when there's no other legal way to listen to them, and now that there's finally a streaming service with Nintendo Music. And turns out Nintendo only has about 20 games in the service, with everything else being drip-fed at a later date. Want to listen to the Wii Sports theme? Sorry kid, wait a few months first. I could make a whole other video about my problems with Nintendo's drip-feeding model, but look, I can assure you Nintendo, making people wait months for music they can already listen to does not build hype. The people who come up with ideas at Nintendo need to be laughed at more. This service almost just serves to make people more anxious that Nintendo Music is gonna get taken down now. Despite this, there are some good features. The fact you can extend songs is really nice, and the playlist system is pretty robust, but there's so many flaws and oops, you can't even pay for this service. You need to pay $20 for Nintendo Switch Online, and that's the only way to get it. Sometimes being a cynical asshole is too easy. Also an alarm clock. They made an alarm clock. As I said before, Nintendo was weird. I almost didn't remember the alarmo. Early this June, I made a retrospective on NES Remix, and for part of this video I discussed the upcoming Nintendo World Championship NES Edition. It was a weird game. It's very similar to the NES Remix games with more of a speedrunning angle. In that video, I had one fundamental question. Will there actually be a market for this? After its release, it turned out the answer was, well, it's Nintendo, so it's not like it'll fail, but it did turn out to be pretty forgotten. Unlike NES Remix. Neat. The funniest part of this game has to be that it contains a feature where you can set an NES game as your favorite, and there's a list of literally every official NES game. Brawl Chronicle is back. I don't think I can fully articulate how weird this is. Nintendo is such a brand-safe company, they don't like acknowledging their weird or bad history unless they can pass it off as a joke, like the Virtual Boy. They even outright denied the existence of those old crappy Zelda games I mentioned earlier in Smash. So to have this full list is unlike them. Game companies can also get weird about acknowledging the names of other video games if they don't have a license to them. The example I always think about is the Street Fighter Anniversary Collection. It talked about Super Street Fighter 4 3D, but it said it was for handheld systems, since they weren't allowed to say 3DS. I don't know, it's just weird that this ended up being the main legacy of the game. The fact you can say that you like Super Jeopardy and put that online. It is now the hour for me to finally give my most prestigious award, the official Kirby & Hills Jotaro Best Animal in Video Game 2024. Last year I awarded the title of this prestigious award to Ochi from Pikmin 4, and then in 2022 it was the cat from Stray. This year I'm finding a little bit more competition. Animal Well and Another Crab's Treasure could provide nominees. Animal Well is literally Animal Well, but I don't think you really play as an animal per se, and I'm not sure if any other animals were really the standout of the game. Another Crab's Treasure is a good idea, but I think there's another Souls-like protagonist who has quite a bit more influence this year. My winner for the 2024 Video Game Animal of the Year award, was that what I called it? Who cares? It's Sun Wukong from Black Myth Wukong. That game was a big deal. Monkey. Let's actually swing back to Nintendo a little bit, because they do have a console on the way. I think it's interesting speculating on what it will be like, once you consider how huge the Switch was for Nintendo. With speculation about Nintendo's next console calls it the Switch 2. I think it's partly because of leaks, but it also makes sense for Nintendo to go down that route. We also know it will be backwards compatible with Switch games, which is a W. In the case of Nintendo's best-selling consoles like the NES, Game Boy, DS, and Wii, they succeeded with a console that has a similar name or design. But in these cases, the successor never quite sells as much as the original. Sometimes it even ends up being a disappointment. Even though the Switch generation has lasted 7 years now, I don't really get an attitude that anyone's fatigued by it. Fans are mostly comfortable with the Switch, and it's doing well. Knowing that, it's going to be very hard for Nintendo to follow it up. And since Nintendo is Nintendo, there's lots of crazy stuff they could do with their next console. Maybe they could make it essentially an upgrade of the Switch like the Game Boy Color, or even completely different. I don't know. I just think I'm going to sit back, stop talking, and buy it if it interests me. So, that's some stuff that happened in 2024. I obviously can't talk about literally everything, as, believe it or not, multi-million-dollar international industries can be hard to get a grip on sometimes. But I think this is some of the notable stuff, and it just highlights again how much of a turning point we're at. With every passing year, more and more indie games seem to slip into success, while every big publisher seems to announce layoffs or downsizing. Video games will have to reinvent themselves soon if this keeps up. Actually, on that note, I want to look forward to some of the announcements in 2025 to see where exactly we're going. 2025 sounds like such a futuristic year. I can't believe I'm going to be living then. The game I'm looking forward to the most in 2025 is probably Fatal Fury. I have a whole video going over why I see this game's existence as a pretty big deal for fighting games, but it's mostly because if it succeeds, more lower budget fighting games that aren't just the big IPs could follow as well. There's also Hunter x Hunter Nen Impact. That's also another great example of a lower budget fighting game I would love to see succeed. It's nice to get an anime fighter that's an actual fighting game for once. I'm just realizing now I didn't even talk about Sparking Zero in this video. In 2024, I'd say the topic of guest characters in fighting game became really controversial, and a lot of people are sick of them. Fatal Fury Mark of the Wolves is not immune to that concept. It's kind of hard to talk about this trend as a whole, because my opinions on each guest character depend a lot on the context, but I will say I don't have a problem with them as a concept, and I even encourage some of the weirder ones. I like Lucy and Guilty Gear Strive. That's one where I can say, alright, I didn't really get what you're going for, but I trust you have a plan. That said, I do think it probably should be eased up on now. The Fatal Fury / Street Fighter cross promotion is a good cap-off for guest characters for the time being. I'll say this, if there's a guest character that's cool, I will like it. But I don't think it's a trend that should be increased in the upcoming years. Of course, how could I forget Like a Dragon, Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii? The weirdest concept for a canon Yakuza story. This game has so many batshit insane things coalescing into a game, and narrative that actually seems like it could work perfectly. Since the Yakuza series is yearly now, I can see more and more of these Gaiden games getting made in the future, and I'm alright with that. Not only does it look like a great Yakuza game, it's actually filling a drought for good single-player pirate games. And really, I have a bit of a soft spot for games, movies, or shows that put an established IP into an unfamiliar genre or setting. There are actually a couple of other games that seem to be doing this in 2025 as well, like Doom: The Dark Ages. That's similar to Pirate Yakuza in that if you hear the concept of the game and aren't interested already, you gotta be the biggest stick in the mud. This type of game also kind of applies to Mafia the Old Country in a way. I mean, like, oh wow, how unique, we set a Mafia game in Italy instead of the US, but it's still a new horizon for the franchise. You don't exactly get open world games set in early 1900s Sicily very often, and given how beautiful Mafia 1's remake looked, I think they could do this justice. That game really wasn't the best, but its gameplay is at least fun enough for me to want to see what this game does with its setting. The next game isn't actually releasing in 2025, but December of this year. It's something I'm mildly intrigued by, at least to see how it fares. Marvel Rivals. It's a hero shooter, which is a genre without much hope after the Concord thing, but it at least has an advantage over Concord with the fact that it's free. I've seen some buzz over the game, and if a new hero shooter actually succeeds, that would be weird. Mostly, I'm just intrigued by the roster and character designs. Some of the character designs are really cool, but some are really bad, but they're all interesting, and unique is a word that applies to the roster as well. The existence of characters like Luna Snow and Jeff the Landshark got my attention for sure. It's free, so I'll probably download it when it comes out if I'm bored enough. So you know how Pikmin is basically treated as one of Nintendo's big franchises now? It's not Animal Crossing level, but Pikmin 4 released, the series seemed to get a whole bunch of attention and fans, and is now treated as one of Nintendo's big series. Please, let Metroid Prime 4 do that with Metroid. After waiting so long, this game's existence is so surreal yet exciting, and I hope it brings us to days where the future of Metroid doesn't feel up in the air. There's not too much to say on the game itself, because we didn't see that much about it, but I will say that the Metroid Prime series has a lot of potential for new set pieces and gameplay mechanics. The biggest game of 2024
plus one, which is 2025.
It's gonna be GTA 6. It's GTA 6. It'll be GTA 6. I don't really have anything to say on it particular. I'm pretty apathetic towards its existence, if I'll be honest here. Although it is important to note this game in the conversation of ballooning game budgets I had earlier. There was some report that this game was costing $1 to $2 billion to make. That's pretty unlikely and not really substantiated, but I don't doubt it costs a shit ton, and it probably will be the most expensive game ever made. There's a reason game budgets went so high in the first place, and when I say the games industry is at a crossroads, that doesn't mean I think any huge changes are happening overnight. Anyways, the last thing is, there's a Minecraft movie now. Yeah, it doesn't look good. You've heard people explain that over and over again. I don't need to say it, but I do find it funny how people are saying it'll flop, as if it's not the Minecraft movie. This is gonna make $1 billion, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, I want to emphasize that for all the talking about the industry I've been doing, I know nothing. I can't tell if this industry is really going to shift or not. These are just my opinions. There are still objective problems with the industry right now, but I can't tell what will happen in the future. This video was a fun way of looking back on this year and the future. Whatever happens, I'm going to continue to support the games I think are worth it, and hopefully playing all the fun stuff. Also, Metal Slug Tactics released when I was writing this. I gotta go play that. Well, anyways, you've been patient enough, or maybe you just skipped through this video. I'll stop beating around the bush, because my game of the year 2024 is a game released in January of this year. The 8th and technically 9th mainline Yakuza game, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. This was pretty obvious. I mean, I talked about Pirate Yakuza, but not this, seriously? Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth takes a long time to actually get to its story. I mean, it's hours before you're even in Hawaii. But those initial hours as Ichiban and Yokohama were some of the most impactful in the franchise, because it just shows the characters living. Isn't this just the best cutscene in the whole game?
I did it! She said yes!
We see the protagonists of the last game thriving in their new lives they were able to carve out until it all gets turned upside down by the whole VTuber situation, and they lose everything pretty much before Ichiban goes to Hawaii. Then, soon enough, the main stuff in Hawaii happens, Kiryu is introduced, and holy shit, this game is great. There's a whole roller coaster of intrigue at first as this thing slowly unfolds before you, and you're introduced to all kinds of new characters and concepts. Yamai, peak Yakuza character. Eventually, this game starts to feel like the perfect Yakuza game. The RPG mechanics of this game aren't changed much from Yakuza Like a Dragon, but the changes that are made are masterful. You're able to move around in combat now, which essentially unlocks a whole bunch of potential in Yakuza Like a Dragon's combat system that wasn't being realized with this lack of free movement. You can knock enemies into environmental objects or use objects as items for lots of crazy setups, and nothing is more satisfying than knocking enemies into a veritable Rube Goldberg machine of pain. It makes for one of my favorite turn-based combat systems I've ever played. On top of that, there's also the job system, which is always a plus for a game like this. I'll be honest, I never really messed with the job system in Yakuza Like a Dragon, mostly because I was overwhelmed by it, but after going a bit out of my comfort zone, it was very rewarding, and I actually went out of my way to try and unlock more jobs later on. Unfortunately though, this game does get grindy at times. In the main story it's usually manageable, but eventually at the final missions it's really difficult even if you grind to the recommended level. This game's normally very easy too, so it's pretty poorly balanced. I also found many areas to be annoying when they're so packed with enemies, and in games so long, finding the same enemy ambushes in the exact same areas each time is annoying. The setting of Hawaii is probably one of the breakout stars of this game, so much that it's even getting its own Gaiden. From what I can tell, this game's map is extremely accurate to Honolulu, and seeing Yakuza characters in America is a bit surprising, sure, but never felt too jarring, because it's implemented with so much care. And just like previous Yakuza games don't shy away with dealing with problems in Japanese society, it doesn't shy away from portraying the social issues facing Hawaii. This game made me way more interested in Hawaii than I've ever been, but I also still never want to actually vacation there. This game cemented that. But not just that, Hawaii's criminal underworld is shown in detail too. In Yakuza Like a Dragon, Isazaki Ijincho had a simple yet well-established dynamic between three criminal groups. In Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, it feels like they tried to replicate that and the story struggled. The Yamai Syndicate is great, no notes. The Ganjei, or Chinese Mafia, is super forgettable to the point people question why it was in the game. Then the other more ethnically diverse Mafia are the Barracudas, and they're fine. They just feel like mid-boss antagonists without much of a face. Their leader, Danny Trejo, is taken out really quickly at the start and then just unceremoniously shows up later for 2 more boss fights. He was kind of a pushover in this game. He pissed his pants and died to a shark. This all makes for a Hawaii that is great, sure, but could have had better world building and just a better balance between those three factions. The real big villain's organization is meant to be Polycana. I wish they got more development though. The only things we seem to see with this group were the righteous good parts like the charity work associated with Akane, then the comically evil cult parts, and it felt like there were some puzzle pieces missing on how people were really radicalized, or just how the organization worked in the first place. I don't even know if those were the real problems, it's just that something felt missing about them. Yakuza actually having a cult as the main antagonist group was a great idea, I just wish it got the justice it deserved. The leader of the group and final boss of Ichiban's story, Bryce, got almost no development and really didn't feel intimidating at all. How exactly did they cook so hard with Shishido in Like a Dragon Gaiden right after this? Speaking of which, Kiryu's story is essentially half the game, and I want to talk about it too. For all this game's flaws, it does its heroes justice, and Kiryu is no exception. It's highlighted again and again that Kiryu is likely in his final days due to his cancer, and the game manages to be an examination of his whole character, and how he lived for the sake of other people. They go crazy with this idea, and introduce lots of previous characters and fanservice for his sub-stories, but it makes sense, and was honestly probably a better send-off than what Yakuza 6 was trying to be. Seeing Karu Sayama back, seeing Akiyama back, amazing. And this story is a great breakdown of Kiryu as a character. Despite Game Awards were still around, Kiryu should win Character of the Year for sure. Of course, there's also his fight with Dojima, Saitama, and Majima, which is a highlight of the game both gameplay and story-wise. People have also criticized the game for leaving Haruka meeting Kiryu as a cliffhanger ending, but realistically that would be a lot to just plop in at the end of this game. Unfortunately, this story has a lot of flaws when it comes to the villain, just like Ichiban's. Masataka Ebina feels like an amalgamation of Kiryu's antagonists from the series with none of what make them work. He's even Ichiban's brother, except Ichiban never confronts him, god damn it. Not the best way of ending Kiryu's story, to be honest, and little baby Iwami might have been preferable, although I'm not opposed to a good old Millennium Tower showdown for the final boss. The problems with the story don't end at antagonists, unfortunately. As it progresses, there are a lot of elements that become underbaked, and as the story becomes more and more bloated, more parts get lost in the rush. Lonnie is a good example. She's built as Ichiban's Haruka figure, but barely has much of a dynamic with him, and Akane didn't feel very impactful too. These messy plotlines made for a pretty unsatisfying conclusion for Ichiban. I also didn't like how they resolved the story about Ichiban's love with Saiko. A really compelling part of the prologue they spent literal hours on, and then they concluded it with a sentence and a dumb joke. I don't know, Saiko got like nothing in this game, and it was lame how she only exists for Ichiban's development. I am glad all the party members came back, but some of them could have been better handled. Now, I might have a lot of problems with this game, but want to see something? Okay, this game was painful to 100%. So many requirements are unreasonable, and I might not have needed to play Mahjong, but I did play Spike Out twice, and I found out that game is not that good. Sorry, Spike Out fans. Glad it's in the game at least. Infinite Wealth is absurdly packed with content. Sub-stories are plentiful and fun, and curious sub-stories are pretty much perfect. Then for Ichiban, it's crazy because he actually got 2 main side stories. The Sujimon stuff, which is essentially a whole other RPG mode, and Jesus Christ, I don't want to talk about Dondoko Island, that haunts me to this day. The fact that there's a whole Yakuza Animal Crossing mode is deeply bizarre in an indescribable way, even for Yakuza. And if I even begin to talk about it, I would derail this video so much, it needs its own video. Not saying I would make that video. It shows this game is huge when there's not just 1, not 2, but 3 separate fishing game mini-games with their own separate mechanics. The worst part about getting to 100% though was the fact that this game locks No Game Plus behind DLC, and the only endgame dungeon behind DLC as well. It's pretty unacceptable, just really a shitty thing of them to do. It was painful to try to get to the max level for the final achievement when the only enemies that can actually pose a challenge cost money. Don't try to 100% this game. Actually, as it turns out, it's not the perfect Yakuza game. Parts of it really crumble near the end, but still, it has such a strong start and so many great moments, doing so much good stuff for the series. I still consider it the best game of 2024. But hey, maybe UFO 50 will be better. Who knows? I am excited to sail the high seas anyways early next year. Thank you so much for watching, and if you're probably still here, I'm going to assume you're a Yakuza fan or just really care about my opinions, or like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. Whichever one, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Let's walk into 2025 together, optimistic for the future. I wrote that before the election, and that line took a way different tone now.